Hi everybody, I'm Beebs Kelley. Welcome back to another video. This is the final in the Netflix series unless we do a Q&A at the end. So, the Netflix series was a hard watch. It was annoying. It was long. There was way too intense piano for what was happening. Way too dramatic. I will say, Liz Garbus did make some leeway, which we will get to a little bit later in today's discussion. Big takeaways though from this series. The Sussexes admit absolutely zero mistakes, faults, emotional, mistakes, nothing. No misjudgments on the Sussexes' part. Absolutely nothing. Not once did they mention anything they could have done better, any mistakes they may have made, or things they could have tried harder on. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So clearly they wanted to send the message that they are very much not to blame for anything ever. Which doesn't take a genius to notice that's the wrong approach, because no matter who you are, chances are if things got rocky and things didn't go according to plan, you probably did make a couple of mistakes along the way. It would have been a very good PR exercise for them to have included some self-reflection in this series, because they dedicated 6 episodes, 6 hours, more than 6 hours, to complaining about other people and things that other people have done and ways that they've been treated. There should have been at least 10% of the time should have been acknowledging their role in those things not working out great. But no. So big PR mistake there. Definitely didn't come across well. Next big takeaway, the Monarchy and the media are bad guys. They really drove this home. They spent a lot of the series focused on telling us what bad guys the Monarchy is and are, and the media especially. They also spent a good portion of time trying to send the general message, like if we were to pick out themes, that the royal family attacked Harry and Meghan and basically were just not nice to Harry and Meghan. Now, Harry and Meghan have since said that they weren't trying to send that sort of a message. But if you look at this series, especially if you're somebody who hasn't followed these stories, that is the impression you would be left with. 100%, no mistake about it. And thus, because of that, also, the other big theme is Sussexes are victims here, you guys. The thing that stood out the most was that they really have a lot to share about themselves. They enjoy talking about themselves. They are very enamored with themselves. And when they're telling stories from their perspectives or things that have happened to them, they always get these smirks on their faces, like it is an absolute delight to be talking about themselves. It would have been wise to tone that down just a little bit so you don't have such a strong image as somebody who's incredibly self-indulgent, but no, because it's the Sussexes. Another really important theme to drive home that both Harry and Meghan seemed to prioritize. Meghan prioritized sharing details about this theme, and Harry seemed very pleased that this was included, was this idea that Meghan knew nothing, which everybody knows isn't true and cannot believe it. But she wanted to make sure people knew that she most definitely did not pursue Harry, that she had no idea who he was, no idea about anything involving the royal family at all. She knew nothing. And it's on its face, even just including so much about this sort of angle is sus. To feel compelled to push this narrative so strongly in and of itself is suspicious. Backfires. The whole thing backfires. Another theme throughout was misinformation or disinformation, which came across and at the end of the series was just a completely hypocritical thing to do, because they pushed so much disinformation and misinformation that talking about it at all made it hypocritical. They are, to be sure, very self-important in a bad way, and it came across unappealing. Harry and Meghan are interesting up until a point to the general public, I think, because Harry is a royal, because there is this strong narrative around Meghan joining the royal family being such a big deal, and because, Princess Diana was a big deal, because King Charles is king and Harry is his son. These sorts of things, these sorts of ties do give a bit of mystery and interest around the Sussexes. But then they squash that and ruin it through their eagerness to just talk about these mundane little problems and make them seem big and scary and problematic in a way that they're just not. Their over-the-top approach really hinders people's interest in them, and then their oversharing of details that don't matter show them and reveal them to be boring, bland, irrational, manipulative, not very pleasant people. So keeping that privacy and keeping your mouth shut more often than not allows for that bit of mystery to tease the public into being more interested in you, and then you can choose to share things in a positive way, which is what we see the Prince and Princess of Wales do so masterfully. So when I finished watching this, I wondered, what if they hadn't gone to such great lengths to make everything seem so over the top dramatic that wasn't that dramatic at all? Like each episode, you would hear this like intense piano mounting really loudly. The way they edited it set the stage that something really intense and juicy was happening. But there just wasn't. And at the end of the day, it was very boring. If you were to break it down into a just play-by-play, it's the most boring list of things discussed ever in a documentary. There's just nothing interesting about any of this. So they clearly took things and sort of tried to blow them up a little bit and make them more dramatic than they really are. What if they hadn't done that? Well, it would be boring content. They probably would have only been able to get about an hour or two out of it rather than 6 hours. There just wouldn't have been much content at all, and it probably wouldn't have been watched like at all, because it just, that intensity and the editing of it and the intense like music and whatnot tricks the viewer into thinking that there's more happening than there is. And then at the end of it, they look back and they're like, that really wasn't that big of a deal. And then it's very forgettable and it doesn't stand out because it wasn't that great. There was no twist. There was no juice in it at all. It was just lame. But it tricks the viewer into thinking that it's building to something that's going to be this big deal. And then there's just nothing at all. It's letdown. Full letdown. By the final episode, they do seem much more concerned with the media, just in general, that the media is the bigger problem, as well as like just more concerned with the media than they should be, rather than that their primary concern was the royal family and the relationships. Whereas at the beginning, it seemed like that was more the approach it was going to go and the angle it was going to go. But then by the time the episodes were over and the series was over, it seemed much more about the media. So that shift there could have happened because they changed the way they edited it and whatnot, and changed what was included some degree because Queen Elizabeth had passed. Or it could be because his family, the royals, are just grey rocking the situation. They are not responding to the Sussexes. They're not engaging with the Sussexes drama. They're not participating in it because it's dumb. And that's the right choice. But because of that, Harry and Meghan had to find a better villain, and it ended up being the media. And they still get so much negative press so often because their approach and the way that they're doing things just isn't working out, for obvious reasons, which we have already discussed at length. For somebody unfamiliar with the Sussex saga or the royals in general, this would have been a very sympathetic view with the impression of validity, which isn't a factual account, because during their, interviews, when they were talking, the editors would put up on screen, the producers, whoever, the people making the Netflix series, put up on screen like fake text messages or emails, making it look like this was the actual correspondence that happened when it wasn't. That was just graphics somebody made on their computer while putting together the Netflix videos. It was very misleading, especially to somebody who is unfamiliar with the situation. So that must have been incredibly frustrating for the royals to deal with, to see something like this come out and to know that it was going to give the wrong impression to a lot of people. Very unfair. So the biggest question at the end of the day is, why did they do it? As PR exercises go, you would think that this was an attempt to humanize the Sussexes. And as I said in my last video, one thread of the storyline did. One element to the Netflix series, the parts where they were showing their personal footage, like personal pictures, private footage from, their family life or things like that, or talking about just their relationship and whatnot, would be more humanizing and fine to include. As cringy and eye-rolly as it is, it still would have been like, okay, I guess that kind of makes sense. And from a PR perspective, you're trying to humanize these people. But to smoosh it into the same series that is heavily critical of all feedback and all press coverage and all people I've ever said anything about the Sussexes at all is a mistake, because that immediately erases any, empathizing or identifying with Harry and Meghan as humans. It erases it because it's so over the top and irrational. But if we are to challenge ourselves to think, why did they do this? Their possible motivations vary. It could just be indulging their egos, which is what it came across as visually a lot of the time. It certainly would make them look and feel important. To divulge uninteresting, bland details about oneself as if it is extraordinary would be a fun exercise for a narcissist like Harry or Meghan. It's like social media on steroids. To make excuses for things. To sort of try to justify things that were poorly received by the public. Things like Oprah interview, clothing choices, outfit choices, various stories and statements and things like the Tom Bradby interview. Trying to sort of soften the bad, sour taste it left in the public's mouths, those sorts of mistakes that they made. It's clear that part of the motivation of the Netflix series was to sort of justify or explain away some of those things. Didn't quite work, but an attempt was made. A third possibility, which we've touched on, communicating to the royal family these justifications for their actions, and to continue to assert that their opinions, demands, and desires were reasonable. Even though we can see that they weren't, Harry and Meghan are still trying to send the message in this Netflix series that they were being reasonable. A fourth possibility, as a motivation to doing this at all, was the victim narrative. To soften the public perception, and even sharing some of their love story bits lent itself to a sort of justification to both of them burning all of their bridges. It's impossible to see the trail of destruction that has followed them and not think that they went way overboard and overreacted in a really, really bad way. It's impossible to not see that. And so by incorporating some of the love story bits, incorporating some of their justifications and their victim narrative angles, they were able to give more of a reason why they did these destructive things. A fifth possibility is to create a record of their own, to be on record that they are right, and to have something documented. Because the media doesn't cover them in a sympathetic way. They probably do. A part of them would feel, if you were to put yourself in her two big shoes, you would recognize that, her side of things, even if we were to think they're not fair or accurate, still, her side of things doesn't get out very often because the media and the public don't respond to her very well. So Netflix could have sort of been their way to have it a historical record that they're right in their ways, or that what they feel matters or something, or validate themselves some way. So it could have been an exercise in validating themselves as well. Sixth possibility, to create a story that they thought would help things, perhaps even in their business dealings, that they're not so bad after all. They're not out to get people. They're not going to breach everyone's privacy, just the royals, and soften the sort of ruthless impression people got of the couple after the Oprah interview. But why do you think they did this? Why do you think they did this Netflix series and did it the way that they did? It's fascinating. They completely neglected all evidence, all facts, the timelines that can be easily checked. They underestimated palace staff or people involved speaking up for themselves or to deliver their side of the story. They ignored their own inconsistencies from previous interviews that they did. Mostly the Oprah interview was in gross contrast and contradiction to the Netflix series. Whether you believe everything they say or not, the ethics and the sort of moral questions that are left hanging are really, really hard to ignore. Like, even if you were to believe every single thing that Harry and Meghan said and take it as fact, it's still impossible to turn a blind eye to the fact that there's a great deal of hypocrisy in every single episode, in every single angle that they're taking. That they broke boundaries and breached the privacy of so many people as they stepped over folks to make this series. That they are thrusting out relentless accusations of many, many different people with zero self-accountability. it really lends itself to people not believing them because of these ethical questions and sort of gray areas. On top of it, there are manipulations, lies, and exaggerations in the Netflix series and other things, and times when they contradicted themselves. If you were to believe everything Harry and Meghan say in Netflix, you would have to accept that they lied endlessly in Oprah, for example, and lied in future interviews that came after Netflix. If you were to take everything they say in Oprah as fact, then you'd be simultaneously accepting many, many lies in the Netflix series and onwards. So even if you wanted and were like, I'm going to just completely believe Harry and Meghan in Netflix, then you're automatically accepting that they lie lots of the other times and that they've lied many other times, that they've breached people's privacy, their family's privacy, that they've spoken poorly about their family and their family's, way of life and institution or whatever you want to call it, their family's careers, jobs. Queen Elizabeth was in charge of it all. That they've talked poorly about people openly who they had personal relationships with, who have never spoken openly and publicly about them. It creates a really weird space for the viewer. Are you going to believe and support everything that they do in Netflix? Then you're going to be, accepting and ignoring or complicit in accepting and sort of glamorizing all these other negatives and poor choices and moral failings, if you could put it that way. Which I think is one of the main reasons why Netflix didn't work in terms of its goal. Its goal was obviously to change people's view of the couple, and it didn't at all. Following Netflix, they were still voted the most disliked public figures or famous people multiple years, twice in a row, and one other time too. I mean, they still have tanking popularity all of the time. It didn't turn around public opinion, and that must be a big part of why. Because at the end of the day, even if you wanted to take Netflix as gospel, then you have to accept that Harry and Meghan have really poor character and made a lot of bad mistakes and did a lot of unethical things. Despite all of that, the director, Liz Garbus, I believe is how you pronounce it, she did successfully communicate a more soft and human side at the end of episode 6, with the clips of them in their home life and Harry talking about, his hopes for the future and stuff like that. I mean, that did come across like it was well enough done that it did come across more sympathetic than I expected. However, it still wasn't enough to tip the scales because ultimately it was unrealistic. The entire time they presented themselves as martyrs and saints and victims with the media, the public, and the royal family as completely out to get them, that they undermined their own efforts in this completely unbelievable dynamic of Harry and Meghan, good, everyone else, bad, accept it. And ignore all the lies and contradictions and breach of other people's privacy and hypocrisy. That in and of itself was so much more of a weight on the series because it took up way more of the series in general, but also just like way more important than that little sliver of sympathetic presentation that we got at the end of episode 6, which, credit to her for pulling out all the stops in the last episode and trying really hard to punctuate the series with this positive, more sympathetic view. It just wasn't enough to outweigh everything else that they did. And overall, visually, there wasn't much fashion to talk about. I planned on doing a fashion edition, but they were sitting down the whole time. There wasn't much fashion to talk about. But visually, they did present the entire series in these sort of soft, muted tones with the very dramatic music. And that combined with the things that they were saying was really a contrast that felt confusing rather than captivating. It didn't really vibe together. It didn't make sense, much like how the opinions on cultural issues and broader Commonwealth implications and whatnot, the almost political commentary that tried to get weaved in there just didn't flow with Harry and Meghan's self-indulgent whining and complaining. And then we had the undercurrent of, oh, it's our love story that's so fabulous. These three threads didn't mesh, just like the soft, sort of muted tones and heavily filtered filming of the interviews and whatnot. It didn't really mesh and vibe with the really intense music and the over-the-top, content and complaining. The complain fest. That's it, you guys. That's the Netflix series done. I look forward to hearing your opinions in the comments, and maybe we will have a final video where I can feature some of your top comments and opinions. So do be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments section. Maybe you'll be featured in that upcoming video. Thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you enjoyed this series and today's video. And as always, I hope you have a happy day ahead. I'll see you next time. Bye.